Hello everybody, David Abram here. Welcome back to my channel. And for today's discussion, I wanted to talk about a little bit of a coined term that I came up with not too long ago. And you probably have already guessed it by the title of this video, fantasy over reality. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that because in the hangout session that I went to last night, we brung up a few key points, and from those key points I kind of spawned this video. And I want to talk about something I've thought for a long time from a MGTOW perspective, or from my perspective as a MGTOW. Now, to start off, I think the fantasy in essence is always, in my opinion, or not my opinion, but my perspective, the fantasy is always better than the real thing. And the reason that the fantasy is always better than the real thing is because the fantasy is that one world where no matter what happens, you can always hit the reset button and you can always configure it to your preference at that time or your liking. No matter what happens. So in your fantasy, you could always, if you wanted to, say that 2 plus 2 is 18, and 10 plus 10 is 100, and 100 plus 100 is 1000. And in the fantasy, notice how I keep using this word fantasy, you're always right, because that is your little world. That's the little world you have strung up from your mind and imagination, and that brings you joy, because you're always right. Things always work out. And then you've got reality. And reality, as we all know, dictates that 2 plus 2 is 4, 3 plus 3 is 6, 4 plus 4 is 8, 5 plus 5 is 10, and so on. I think you kind of catch my drift on this one. And today I want to talk a little bit about the blue pill men and concerns to MGTOW, and how these blue pill men, since they haven't been really exposed to reality, I'll call this reality in this sense, and you may be wondering what I mean by that. Why do I say blue pill men have not been exposed to reality? And what I mean when I say blue pill men haven't been exposed to this reality is that, let's take the fantasy for example. The blue pill men, as well as red pill men, I'm pretty sure, all men have this fantasy, this illusion that they captivate themselves in, and they wrap their minds around it, and that's part of what drives us as a species to want to keep moving forward. And that's what's made us, especially as men, become very innovative and advanced civilization. We've always wrapped our minds around fantasies, and some of these fantasies start off as dreams, and these dreams start to become reality as time goes on. Certain components of it, such as going from, the 16-bit era of games to 32-bit era, and then from 32-bit era to 64-bit era, men, generally speaking, have a tendency to think outside of the box, even more so than women. And that's why men have been the main innovators through civilization. No matter what civilization you really go to, they're all built off the foundation of a patriarchy, and this is the reason for that being so. Men naturally are the builders, they're the creators, they're the maintenance men, they're basically the blueprints or the DNA of society. They are the building blocks of society, and without men, truthfully, nothing can actually be ran. I mean, yeah, you may have some exceptions of women who work in those blue-collar settings and innovate things, but ultimately the building blocks are predominantly men. And the same thing goes for today. But when it comes to this fantasy, I went off on a little bit of a tangent there, but when it comes to the fantasy, for men having fantasies, especially blue pill men, I wouldn't condemn that or say that's wrong or anything of that caliber, but what I really think is that it's one thing to have a fantasy and understand that it's fantasy, and that fantasy is just that. It's an illusion, or it's fictional, if you will, make-believe, meaning it only exists in the confines of your imagination. It only exists in the confines of your mind. It doesn't exist outside of your mind. In other words, I could believe in a fantasy, but I know fantasy is not reality. So for these blue pill men who live in this perpetual idea that fantasy is reality, that being in part is because truthfully these men have never been exposed to reality. I mean, real, hard truth, hardcore reality, which is the red pill. That's why a lot of men get this misconception that marriage is love. And if you ask a red pill man, like maybe perhaps myself, I don't speak for all MGTOWs, but this is just my perspective on marriage. Marriage is a gynocentric institution to ensure the security and stability of the family unit and make sure that women essentially have future provisions made and set up for them. I mean, that's how the system has kept recycling itself, and that's how society has essentially been maintained and remained functional. But I think the key component I want to drive home with this video is that fantasy is fine, because I do believe the fantasy is infinite. It's better than the real thing. In the fantasy, you can always have a special someone and configure them to your preference of liking, whether they be a redhead, a brunette, a goth, a blonde, a ginger, whatever it is that strikes your particular fancy, you're always right. But the problem is when blue pill men, particularly those simps and manginas and white knights, mistake this fantasy from reality. And in some cases, when they realize that the fantasy is not the reality, sometimes if they're that far gone as a blue pill man, it's really too late. And even if they get brought through the cleaners in divorce and alimony and child support, and if they're really that hardcore of a blue pill man, then if that doesn't convince them that fantasy is not the same as reality, then I don't really think anything is going to convince them. And this really kind of ties back to one of my earlier videos from a while ago. There's two types of blue pill men. There's the first type, where they are legitimate victims and they are not aware of the red pill and they're not aware of the truth. And part of that is because they're never confronted with the truth. And so the men who are not confronted with the truth, yeah, obviously they're going to mistake fantasy for reality in a sense of the gender dynamics and women as a whole and female nature, because they've never been confronted with the truth, so they wouldn't be able to effectively distinguish between reality and fantasy. So they bring the fantasy into the real world, and when they do that, and then they're brought through the cleaners in divorce and the biased court systems and this, that, and the third, ostracizing from the main herd of the group, then that's when they usually realize, okay, where did I go astray? I've got to lay out my cards, and I've got to sit down and really simmer this through. And then you have the type 2 blue pill men, where all that could happen to them and they will still remain a simp and a white knight and a mangina, and they will never enter reality because it's too much of a facepalm. But I think it's really, really important, especially for the newcomers and MGTOWs, to understand fantasy is not reality. And I don't really blame all the blue pill men who do believe this fantasy is a reality, because look around. We have things like Beauty and the Beast, Cinderella, Snow White, Shrek. Oh my goodness, there's so many from Disney. Frozen, Rapunzel. There's so Titanic. They're all there. There's so many out there that there's really no getting away from it before you take the red pill. I was there myself. All MGTOWs were there at some point in the past. But eventually there comes a point where you are exposed to this red pill. And then after that, that's when you ultimately have the decision on your own as a man to choose reality or to choose fantasy. And again, you can have fantasy. At least from my perspective as a MGTOW, I know I definitely have fantasy. But the only problem that lies with today is when men, instead of accepting reality and working with reality to adapt to the new environment, they choose to remain in this fantasy, and they take the fantasy into the real world. And when they're confronted with the truth, which is divorce and whatever it is, such as a false rape accusation or whatever their case and scenario may be, that's when their world will ultimately come crashing down on them. And I think it's important for a lot of the younger guys to be aware of this, because nowadays there are no more male spaces. This is the last line of defense for men, and men are not really getting that help. They're not getting that counseling, and they're not getting that support network to know that the fantasy is not reality because of this gynocentric establishment we're currently under. But I don't know. What do you guys think as MGTOWs? Do you think I was spot on with this one? You think I missed anything? Do you agree, disagree? If you do have any resonating thoughts on this matter, please do feel free to leave them in the comment sections below. Please do like, subscribe, and until the next time, thanks for watching. So basically, to sum things up, all men, I think, have some fantasy in the confines of their mind, but there comes a point where they have to draw the line between fantasy and reality, and unfortunately, blue pill men never draw this line, and so that's where the problem lies. And I'll leave everybody with that thought, signing out.